Hey guys, tonight we settle in for a story that is decidedly not a lighthearted caper. We're traveling back to a time of smoky courtrooms and cold, damp prison cells, the height of the witch trials,
accused
specifically
of sorcery.
focusing on the most vulnerable of the accused pregnant women. Now, before you start thinking this is going to be some adrenaline-fueled horror fest, I promise you this is boring history for sleep. We'll be looking at the excruciatingly slow legal and theological debates that surrounded these women, focusing less on the burning and more on the bureaucratic red tape. I want you to close your eyes, or at least let your gaze unfocus on whatever screen you're using, and imagine the scene. You are standing in the gloom of a 17th century European village, the smell of wood smoke and unwashed wool hanging heavy in the
demonic
air.
liaison is clearly described
A harsh
here.
autumn rain
And the
is
unholy
turning the
seed that
unpaved
follows.
alleyways into mud. You see a woman being escorted by two grim-faced local guards. She is not a caricature with a pointy hat. She is just a woman. She's wearing simple rough cloth, and the fabric strains noticeably around her middle. She is accused of the gravest crime imaginable, of forging a pact with the devil himself, and yet as you watch her stumble in the mud, you realize a simple biological fact: she is carrying life. In that deeply religious, utterly terrified world, her pregnancy created an agonizing legal and moral contradiction. You probably won't survive this scenario if you were actually there, given how easily suspicions could fall. But don't worry, you're safe and cozy now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the drafty hall, where you, the accused, stand before the magistrate. The first accusation detailing the maleficium, the harmful act of witchcraft, might be that you caused a local cow to run dry or spoiled a neighbor's batch of ale. The real horror, however, descends not when the accusation is read, but when the authorities must decide how to proceed with the punishment. The law, even the deeply twisted law of the witch hunts, had a long, confusing history of dealing with pregnant criminals. This is where your state, your condition, becomes a temporary life-saving shield. The moment the guards or the examining inquisitor confirms your visible gravidity, that's the fancy legal term for being pregnant, the entire machinery of immediate execution grinds to a confusing halt. In almost every legal system that inherited Roman or medieval common law from England to the German states, and even the more sporadic witch trials handled by the Spanish Inquisition, which, fun fact, generally thought most witch panics were just local peasant superstitions and didn't pursue them nearly as aggressively as secular courts did. The principle was often the same: the state should not kill an innocent party. And the party deemed innocent, at least temporarily, was the unborn child. This concept was known in common law as reprieve for the belly, or in Latin, Plea Ventrem Inspiciendum, the plea to inspect the belly. It's a mainstream historical fact that this legal loophole, intended to protect property rights, an heir could still inherit and ensure the child's soul was saved, through baptism, became the single most important reprieve a woman on trial for a capital crime could possess. It wasn't an automatic pardon. It was a delay button. But in the frenzy of a witch hunt, where hysteria could peak and subside in a matter of months, a delay of 9 months or sometimes less, depending on how far along you were, could mean the difference between the pyre and prison. Imagine the damp, oppressive quiet of the courtroom. After your confession, perhaps extracted under duress, has sealed your fate. The judge pronounces the sentence, death by burning or hanging, and then you raise your hand, or your lawyer, if you're lucky enough to have one, utters those crucial words, "Plead the belly." The judge, though eager to dispatch a witch, is bound by centuries of legal tradition designed to protect the fetus. This leads us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. Sometimes the accusation of witchcraft itself became twisted to account for the pregnancy. In many trials, especially those influenced by the Malleus Maleficarum, that terrible guide for witch hunters, if a woman was married and childless for many years, only to become pregnant after her alleged pact with the devil, that pregnancy was cited as proof of her demonic liaisons. The child, therefore, was not considered a human innocent, but a demon seed, a spawn of the incubus or succubus. This accusation sought to nullify the legal reprieve, turning the protective bump into damning evidence. In these dark moments, the reprieve for your belly was a flimsy shield indeed, easily pierced by the sharp points of religious paranoia. The legal and theological debate over whether the child of a condemned witch was truly innocent or already tainted is one area where historians still argue whether the concern was primarily legal, preserving the crown's right to an heir, or genuinely theological, saving a soul. The fact remains that for many women, like the famous Abigail Faulkner, during the Salem witch trials, a case that happened outside the Inquisition's direct purview but followed similar legal precedents, the delay was a literal lifesaver, allowing the local hysteria to burn out before her time came. Your reprieve, however, is short-lived. It merely kicks the terrifying can 9 months down the cobblestone road. Your temporary reprieve, that pause button, pressed by the simple fact of your pregnancy, is contingent on one very important and often deeply embarrassing procedure the legal system has to make absolutely sure you're telling the truth. You claimed reprieve for the belly, and the court's response is to immediately convene what's called a Jury of Matrons. This isn't your standard jury of 12 good men and true. This is a hand-picked panel of married, experienced women, often midwives or respected matrons from the community, whose job is to perform a physical examination and deliver a verdict on your internal state. Imagine the absolute indignity of this moment. You are already mentally and physically exhausted from the interrogation and the miserable conditions of the holding cell. Now you're led into a small, private chamber, private, only in the sense that the public isn't watching, but certainly not private to you, and stripped down so these 12 strangers can poke, prod, and peer. The air is thick with the smell of stale straw and nervous sweat. These matrons, perhaps your former neighbors or acquaintances, are now agents of the court, tasked with determining if you are quick with quick child. The term quick with quick child is where the legal process gets fascinatingly and frustratingly vague. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit that this jury was not just confirming pregnancy. They were trying to ascertain the moment of quickening, which was the point at which the mother first felt the fetus move. For centuries, this was the moment that the fetus was believed to gain a soul, to become legally recognized as an independent life. If the matrons determined you hadn't quickened yet, or if they found no palpable sign of life, the reprieve could be denied and your execution might proceed rapidly. Why? Because the law was concerned with the soul, and a fetus without a soul was merely a part of the mother, and thus not an innocent person to be protected. If they thought you were only a few weeks pregnant, they might very well proceed, arguing that a few weeks' delay wasn't enough to justify the protracted costs and anxieties of keeping a confessed witch alive. In most cases, the matrons were looking for physical sign-swelling hardness, the absence of menstruation, but the quickening was the gold standard. A very mainstream historical fact here is that this process was notoriously unreliable. In an era without sonograms, obviously, or even a fully developed understanding of female anatomy, the jury's decision was subjective and often swayed by personal bias, local gossip, or the accused woman's own physical presentation. If you were a thin woman in the early stages, the jury might rule against you. If you were heavy-set, the reprieve might be granted, simply because they couldn't tell the difference between fat and fetus. It's a chilling reminder that your life literally hung on the guesswork of 12 women whose only medical training was personal experience with childbirth. The power of this jury also highlights a strange paradox of the witch trials. The system that was overwhelmingly male in its judiciary and theology suddenly deferred its ultimate judgment to a group of ordinary women. Historians still argue whether the Jury of Matrons represented a momentary pragmatic concession to female expertise in bodily matters, or if it was simply a way for male judges to deflect moral responsibility for potentially killing an unborn and theoretically innocent child. Was it respect for women's knowledge or just legal cowardice? Probably a little of both, if we're being gently cynical. Once the matrons delivered their verdict, let's say, they've confirmed you are indeed quick. The judge formally issues the reprieve. This is the point where you are returned to prison. The chains feel lighter, and the cold of the stone walls suddenly seems less final. However, this is not a victory. It is a stay of execution. You know deep in your bones that the countdown has merely been reset. And while you are grateful for the delay, there's a new terror. The authorities now start to wonder about the father. If you are a married woman, they suspect the devil has replaced your husband. If you are unmarried, they are certain of it. And that, unfortunately, leads the entire court down a much darker, far more paranoid path than a spoiled batch of ale ever could. The reprieve has saved your life for now, but it has intensified the scrutiny on the very nature of your child. You are safe, but now your unborn baby is deemed potentially infernal. The waiting game has begun, and the silence of the cell is no longer comforting. The matrons have left their verdict that you are quick with quick child, now stamped onto the heavy parchment of the court record. But what does that really mean? You've avoided the immediate swing of the rope or lick of the flames, yet you've traded one agonizing certainty for 9 months of soul-crushing limbo. To understand your new temporary legal status, you have to peer into the fascinatingly complex, utterly medieval mind on the concept of fetal personhood. You see, for the legal minds of the era, the issue wasn't simply pregnancy. It was the arrival of the soul. The law of the time, rooted deeply in theological and classical philosophy, didn't recognize the fetus as a legal person from the moment of conception. Instead, it relied on quickening the moment you, the mother, first felt the movement within you. This is where the legal and the spiritual overlapped, giving your belly the power of temporary sanctuary. This concept of quickening as the point of ensoulment is a mainstream historical fact holding sway in English common law and various continental legal codes for centuries. Until you quickened, the fetus was seen legally as part of your body, a kind of growth. Once you felt that distinct flutter, that first little kick that meant the soul had entered, and the entity inside you was now an individual life. The state, even when executing a confessed witch, had a divine duty not to commit double murder, or more importantly, to them damnation by killing a soul. Think about the absurdity for a moment. You're condemned for conversing with the devil, a supernatural crime, and yet your fate is decided by a purely physical, subjective sensation. Did you feel it move? If you said yes, your life was spared, at least for a while. If you said no, you were doomed. The matrons, in their brief, clumsy examination, were attempting to confirm a spiritual event through physical proxy, the detectable movement. It's like trying to find Wi-Fi using only a sundial. The lack of precision is terrifying, and yet it was the best system they had. The medieval scholars were themselves deeply divided on the timing of this ensoulment, which is a great quirky or fringe tidbit of history. Influenced by Aristotle and later by figures like Thomas Aquinas, theologians often speculated that the soul entered at different times based on sex. The general belief repeated by many scholars was that a male fetus received its rational soul around 40 days after conception, while the more imperfect female fetus took longer, perhaps 80 or 90 days. So if you were carrying a girl, the law might argue you still hadn't quickened, pushing your execution date forward. This delay wasn't a product of modern biology, of course. It was just a strange, ancient belief system dictating the moment of your life or death. If you were a man being tried for treason, your fate was sealed the moment the hammer dropped. If you were a woman being tried for witchcraft, you had to wait for philosophy to align with biology, or at least pre-modern biology. Your cell now becomes a waiting room, a theological purgatory. The focus shifts from proving your guilt to ensuring the ritualistic purity of the legal process. They fear that if they execute you before the birth, they are guilty of what was often termed infanticide. Moreover, they worry that the child will be born unbaptized, thus guaranteeing the innocent soul's eternal damnation, a catastrophic failure in a society obsessed with salvation. This brings us to a point where historians still argue whether the concern over the unborn child was driven by genuine Christian charity and a desire to save the soul from hell, or if it was simply a legal formality, a protective measure for the state. If the state killed an innocent, its own divine authority was undermined. Was it compassion for the child, or was it a cold, rational move to preserve the legitimacy of the court's power under God? The chilling truth is that in many cases, once the child was born baptized and thus saved, the mother's execution was carried out with swift, brutal efficiency. The child's existence was secured and your temporary shield evaporated. In the meantime, the very fact of your pregnancy has put you in a new category of suspicion. Remember Merga Bien, a woman accused of witchcraft in the Fulda trials of the early 17th century. She became perhaps the most famous case of a pregnant woman accused during this period. She was married for years without having children. When she was arrested, she was found to be pregnant. To the witch hunters, led by the zealous Prince Abbot Balthasar von Dernbach, this wasn't a reprieve. It was irrefutable proof of her dark covenant. If your husband wasn't the father, they reasoned then who was. The answer in the minds of the inquisitors was chillingly simple, and it's the subject well turned to. Next, you weren't carrying a human child at all. You were carrying the devil's progeny, conceived during a blasphemous union. Your successful plea for life, by virtue of a quickened child, has paradoxically turned your very fertility into the ultimate evidence of your complete and utter corruption. The reprieve bought you time, but it also opened the door to the most terrifying accusation of all. The reprieve is granted, but the silence of the prison cell now screams a question that overshadows the old charges of spoiled milk and wicked weather. Who is the father? If the child is not your husband's, or if you are unmarried, the only conclusion for the witch hunters is that your pregnancy is the ultimate, undeniable evidence of your complete surrender to the powers of darkness. You are now facing the terrifying charge of infernal conception. In the paranoid theological climate of the witch trials, the idea of a demonic sexual pact was not a fringe concept. It was a mainstream historical fact, central to the theory of witchcraft itself. The belief held that the devil, in the form of an incubus, A male demon would lie with the witch, resulting in a monstrous, or paradoxically, a perfectly ordinary-looking child. This child was often considered a changeling, or worse, a physical testament to the witch's betrayal of Christ and humanity. The reasoning was perverse and meticulous. If you had been married for years without issue, as in the case of Merga Bien, whom we touched on earlier, and then you became pregnant after being accused of witchcraft, the timing itself was taken as proof. The inquisitors claimed the devil was actively helping you produce a child, not a human child, but a demon seed to replenish his earthly ranks. This twisted logic was even applied to miscarriages or stillbirths, which were then blamed on the witch's other demonic acts, such as delivering the child to the devil for a witch's Sabbath sacrifice. The simple act of your female biology was weaponized against you. Imagine the interrogation that follows the reprieve. It shifts from demanding confessions of maleficium, harmful magic, to excruciating detail about your sexual life. They wanted to know about the incubus. Did he feel cold? Was he unusually large? Did he leave a mark? The psychological torment of being forced to describe intimate and often imaginary encounters with a demon was calculated to break your mind. For some women, this was a fresh, horrifying trauma added to the initial accusation. This leads us to a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit concerning the mechanics of demonic conception. Medieval demonologists, like those who wrote the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, had a theory that was oddly concerned with logistics. The incubus, they argued, could not conceive on its own. Instead, a succubus, a female demon, would first steal semen from a man, often the witch's own sleeping husband, and then the incubus would transfer that stolen seed into the witch. The child was thus a perverse hybrid human material, but conceived through a demonic act and infused with evil intent. It's a terrifyingly specific and bizarre intellectual construction, a whole subgenre of paranoid literature designed to explain away the inconvenience of a pregnant witch. The practical impact of this accusation of infernal conception was that it tried to nullify the legal sanctuary you had won. If the child was the devil's spawn, the argument went, it was not an innocent soul. Therefore, the reprieve for the belly did not apply. However, this was a difficult legal hurdle, even for the most zealous judges. The mainstream legal tradition was strong, better a demon seed survive than a human soul be damned through execution. This conflict between theological paranoia and legal precedent is why historians still argue whether the charge of infernal conception was primarily a psychological tool to force confessions or a genuine attempt to overcome the legal protections afforded by the quickening doctrine. Regardless of the legal outcome, the social judgment was immediate. You were now doubly damned. Your neighbors believed you were carrying an abomination, and your continued existence was seen as a moral blight on the community. The conditions of your imprisonment would likely become harsher, the guards more fearful of you, and the general environment more isolating. Your belly, which offered a brief sanctuary, has now become a target, a symbol of the devil's victory in your life. You are awaiting a birth that the court hopes will provide a human heir for the state and the church, but that they privately fear will unleash a creature of the night. It is a waiting game of faith, fear, and legalistic maneuvering, all focused on the inevitable moment of delivery. Now let's step away from the damp cell and into the dusty, leather-bound world of the ultimate guidebook for witch hunters. The document that looms over your head, and indeed over much of the early modern witch trials, is the Malleus Maleficarum. This Latin title translates chillingly to the Hammer of the Witches, and it was first published in 1487 by two German Dominican Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. For you, the pregnant defendant. This text is essentially a roadmap to your doom, detailing the exact ways your condition could be used against you. It's a mainstream historical fact that while the Spanish Inquisition largely dismissed the malleus, the secular courts and inquisitors in parts of Germany and France treated it like a holy writ. It codified the belief in the demonic pact and critically offered specific paranoid instructions regarding women's fertility and children. The authors were deeply suspicious of female biology, viewing it as inherently weaker and more susceptible to the devil's influence. The malleus deals with pregnant witches and midwives in excruciating detail. It posits that witches aided by demons can cause infertility in men, and women render husbands impotent, a very popular concern at the time, and most relevantly to you slay infants in the mother's womb. This is why your pregnancy, even while temporarily saving you, is seen as so profoundly threatening. Your womb is not just a place of life, it's a potential laboratory for the devil's work. A quirkier tidbit is the malleus's obsession with midwives. The authors claimed that no one was more dangerous to the faith than a midwife witch. Why? Because the midwife had intimate access to the birthing chamber, the child right at its most vulnerable moment, and the mother's body. They asserted that midwives would often murder babies before baptism, thus guaranteeing the child's damnation or dedicate them to the devil. If you were a midwife and pregnant, your case was practically closed before the trial even began. The text also provides guidance on interrogating pregnant women. The authors explicitly stated that although an execution must be delayed until after the birth to protect the innocent soul, the interrogation, including the use of torture, could and should continue. They argued that if the witch refused to confess under duress, the pain she felt was not truly pain, but the devil's work stiffening her resolve. You are experiencing the ultimate bureaucratic nightmare. The law protects the fetus from execution, but gives the court permission to psychologically and physically torment the host body that is carrying it. The influence of the malleus created a legal and theological paradox. It solidified the need for the reprieve for the belly, yet at the same time it provided the most compelling intellectual argument for why the reprieve should be canceled, because the child might be a demon or already damned. This circular reasoning is why historians still argue whether the malleus maleficarum prolonged the witch trials by providing a theological structure for paranoia, or whether it ultimately served to constrain local hysteria by forcing judges to follow a strict, albeit dreadful, legal framework. Was it fire or a fire extinguisher that ran on fire? In your cell, you try to recall the names of your neighbors who testified against you. Were they local farmers who lost a pig? Or were they perhaps influenced by the terrifying sermons of a traveling preacher who carried a copy of the malleus? You realize that your predicament is less about what you did and everything about what men believed you could do, specifically what you could do with the extraordinary, mysterious, and therefore deeply suspicious power of a woman's body to create life. The waiting continues. The child is growing, the date of delivery approaches, and the court knows that the minute the child is safe and baptized, your life returns to its scheduled conclusion. The clock, which was reset with your plea, is now ticking down to zero. But wait, we've been talking about the Inquisition and secular courts almost interchangeably. The distinction is crucial because where you were tried dramatically affected whether that little baby bump was a reprieve or a death sentence. You are in a prison cell, your fate, hanging in the balance because of the life growing inside you. But where exactly are you? The answer to that question, were you tried by an ecclesiastical court, the formal Inquisition, or a secular court. A local civil or royal judge is a difference between a terrifying ordeal and almost certain death. This distinction is a cornerstone of understanding the witch trials. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Spanish and Roman Inquisitions were paradoxically often less eager to pursue witchcraft accusations than were the secular courts, especially during the height of the panics in the 16th and 17th centuries. The official inquisitors were highly educated theologians and lawyers who tended to view most local claims of witchcraft as mere superstition or simple maleficium, harmful magic that was not necessarily tied to the grand theological crime of making a pact with the devil. For them, the real danger was heresy. This skepticism meant that in areas under the direct sway of the Inquisition, like Spain or most of Italy, the number of executions for witchcraft was dramatically lower, often in the single digits or low double digits throughout the entire period. If you were accused and found pregnant here, the reprieve for the belly would be rigorously applied, and there was a higher chance your charges would later be reduced or dismissed once the initial furor died down. Now shift the scene. You are in a German principality, a French parlement, or a village in Scotland. These areas were governed by secular civil courts, often staffed by local magistrates or noblemen who lacked the theological training and legal rigor of the inquisitors. They were deeply influenced by popular fear, the explicit instructions of texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, which the Roman Inquisition often ignored, and the belief that they were fighting a literal war against Satan. These secular courts were the engine of the massive witch hunts responsible for the vast majority of the estimated 30,000 to 60,000 executions across Europe. In these courts, the pregnant witch faced a much grimmer reality. While the principle of protecting the fetus, the Plea Ventrem, Inspiciendum, was part of common law across Europe, the secular judges were far more likely to embrace the concept of infernal conception. They would treat the pregnancy not as a reason for compassion, but as an aggravating circumstance proof that you had literally fornicated with the devil. The delay was treated as an intolerable inconvenience, not a legal duty. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. The jurisdiction often became a fierce legal battleground. A woman accused of witchcraft might be handed back and forth between the ecclesiastical and secular courts, each trying to either claim the prestige of rooting out the devil secular or avoid the messy business of a capital conviction based on dubious evidence, inquisition. Your temporary safety hinged on which court ultimately held the keys to your cell. If the inquisitors had you, you might survive. If the secular judge did, you were merely delaying the inevitable. This distinction highlights why historians still argue whether the witch hunts were primarily a religious phenomenon or a social and legal one. If the most overtly religious institution, the Inquisition, was the most skeptical, doesn't that suggest the trials were more about local political power, social control, and fear of women than about formal theology? For you, the accused, the theological distinction means the difference between your child inheriting a life or inheriting only a very brief, tragic infancy. The irony is cruel. The Catholic Church highly formalized, albeit rigid legal structure often protected you from the very panic that its own theological underpinnings had helped create. But if you fell under the rough, swift justice of a local government, terrified by the specter of the devil in their backyard, your pregnancy became a ticking clock, counting down to the moment you delivered your child into the arms of the executioner. The child's soul must be saved. But what about its welfare after you are gone? That is a question the courts were far less interested in answering. The reprieve is in place. Your belly is your shield. But now, as you sit in the cold, your mind must confront a fear perhaps greater than your own impending doom, the fate of your child's soul. In this deeply religious, almost fanatically spiritual age, the state's primary concern wasn't just physical life. It was eternal salvation. This deep-seated anxiety over the infant soul is a mainstream historical fact that explains the entire rationale behind the reprieve for the belly. The Catholic Church taught, and this was universally accepted by all Christian denominations of the time, that an unbaptized soul was destined for limbo, or worse, eternal damnation. For the court to execute you before the child was born was to commit two cardinal sins, killing an innocent and damning a soul for all eternity, by denying it the chance for the sacrament of baptism. Think of the medieval legal system as a complex clanking machine dedicated to maintaining divine order. Your death is necessary to purge the sin of witchcraft and satisfy justice. But the child's soul is a precious commodity that must be salvaged. Therefore, the court's focus narrows down to ensuring that the baby is delivered alive and then immediately is subjected to the rite of baptism. This is the only way the state could reconcile its religious duty, saving souls, with its judicial duty, executing witches. The fear was so great that it gave rise to a quirky or fringe tidbit of theological debate. What if the child was born while the mother was on the way to the scaffold, or even during the execution itself? The infamous, though perhaps exaggerated, case of Paratine Massey from Guernsey in 1556, a heresy trial. Not a witch trial, but following similar principles, illustrates this horror. She allegedly gave birth as she was burning at the stake. While the historical details are disputed, the tale was widely circulated precisely because it encapsulated the ultimate nightmare, the innocent child being damned alongside the wicked mother. Inquisitors and judges were explicitly instructed to prevent this scenario, underscoring their theological commitment to the unborn. The child's fate created a massive logistical problem for the authorities. Who would care for the child after you, the mother, were executed? The state didn't want the financial burden, and the community was often terrified of raising a potential demon seed. Sometimes family members, a sister, a cousin, or the child's father, if he was deemed innocent, would reluctantly agree to take the infant, often under a cloud of suspicion and intense scrutiny from the local clergy. The child's name, in some documented cases, was a public declaration of repentance or divine mercy, a constant heavy reminder of the mother's crime. This leads us to an area where historians still argue whether the concern over the child's soul was truly altruistic or a form of state self-protection. Did they genuinely care about the tiny, fragile soul, or were they more concerned with avoiding the divine retribution that might fall upon the town if they allowed an innocent, unbaptized soul to be sent to hell? It's a subtle but important difference, was it? Compassion for the individual or ritualistic fear for the collective. The tension ratchets up as your due date approaches. The court has granted you life for the sake of your child, but your connection to that child is now what ensures your impending death. Every kick you feel, the very movement that once confirmed your reprieve, now signals the rapid approach of your execution day. You are the vessel, and once the precious cargo of the soul is delivered and secured by baptism, the vessel is deemed redundant and dangerous. You are a living example of a cruel legal formula. The length of your remaining life is exactly 9 months, minus whatever time you had already spent pregnant when you first pled the belly. The only thing certain now is the birth and the terrifying final countdown that begins the moment it is over. Let's now turn our attention from the legal theories to a grim, heartbreaking reality. The story of Merga Bien from the town of Fulda, Germany, a case that tragically encapsulates everything we've discussed about pregnant witches. Her experience is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating precisely how the system could twist a life-saving reprieve into a final damning piece of evidence. Merga Bien lived in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, an heiress who had been married 3 times. The crucial detail, the one that sealed her fate, was her long-term childlessness in her 3rd marriage to Blasius Bien. When the zealous Prince Abbot Balthasar von Dernbach returned to power in Fulda in 1602, he unleashed a brutal witch hunt that saw over 200 people executed in just a few years. Merga was caught in this terrifying sweep and arrested in March 1603. Upon her arrest and subsequent detention, her husband Blasius courageously protested to the highest imperial court, the Reichskammergericht, pointing out a simple biological fact: Merga was pregnant. He was demanding the reprieve for the belly, the Plea Ventrem Inspiciendum, which was legally required. Here's where the persecution went off the rails, moving from mere accusation to infernal paranoia. Merga was brutally interrogated, tortured historians believe, and confessed to the murder of her 2nd husband and her children from a previous marriage. But the centerpiece of her new forced confession was the pregnancy itself. Because she and Blasius had been married for 14 years without having a child, the interrogators concluded her current pregnancy could only be the result of intercourse with the devil. The long period of infertility, which could easily be explained by any number of biological reasons, was now twisted into proof of a demonic spell that prevented conception, which was later lifted only to allow a demon seed to be planted. The pregnancy was thus classified as an aggravating circumstance, a clear physical manifestation of her demonic pact. This is a terrifying example of how the abstract theological theory of infernal conception became a practical legal tool to overcome the legal protection of the fetus. The court was in essence saying, the law protects an innocent human child, but this is a demon's progeny, so the protection is void. This brings up a fascinating, quirky, or fringe tidbit. The trial records from this period sometimes contain descriptions of the supposed physical attributes of the children conceived with an incubus. They were often said to be overly hairy, abnormally cold, or monstrous. Merga Bien's child, however, was likely a perfectly ordinary baby. Yet the court didn't need a physical monster. They needed a theological monster to justify overriding centuries of common law regarding the reprieve. Merga's case is a painful illustration of the conflict. While her husband's appeal did delay the process, the zealous local court was determined to proceed. She was convicted not despite her pregnancy, but because of it. Merga Bien was tragically burned alive at the stake in Fulda in late 1603. It's unclear whether she had already given birth at the time of her execution, but the historical consensus is that she was killed very soon after the birth, or even while still carrying the child, under the justification that the fetus was a product of the devil. Historians still argue whether Merga's execution was a gross legal anomaly that ignored the standard reprieve tradition, or if it was a calculated move by the Prince Abbot to establish the absolute authority of the local court even over imperial law in matters deemed to be a divine emergency. For you, the accused in your cell, the story of Merga Bien is a silent warning. It proves that the shield of your pregnancy is not impenetrable. If the local magistrate is sufficiently zealous and the hysteria is high enough, the very source of your reprieve will be used as the heaviest chain that binds you to the fire. Your only hope A flimsy hope at best is that the intensity of the hunt subsides before your time of delivery arrives. The grim reality of Merga Bien's fate brings us to a more calculated, if ethically dubious, aspect of the prison. Experience the possibility of using pregnancy as a recurring delay tactic. You have witnessed how your current state granted you a reprieve. It begs a question that must have haunted the minds of every woman of childbearing age tossed into a witch trial. Prison, could you deliberately get pregnant again while incarcerated to achieve a second stay of execution? This concept, though it sounds like a plot from a dark comedy, is rooted in the very real legal desperation of the time. The reprieve for the belly was granted to protect the unborn child. If after giving birth, and the first death sentence was confirmed, you somehow became pregnant again, the legal principle should mandate another delay. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit that, yes, some women on death row, facing capital punishment for various crimes, not just witchcraft, would attempt to become pregnant in prison. They were literally betting on biological necessity to beat the hangman. The problem, of course, was logistics, especially in the context of a heavily guarded witch trial prison. How would you accomplish this? The jails were segregated, miserable places. However, as a mainstream historical fact, contact was not always impossible. Jailers, guards, or even fellow male prisoners might be bribed, or sometimes, sadly, force was involved. The act of seeking pregnancy was a desperate gamble, trading the risk of a new horrifying birth and the subsequent execution for a few more months of life. The courts were not blind to this tactic, and the legal system eventually tried to close this loophole. In some jurisdictions, especially later in the 18th century, judges began to rule that a woman could not plead the belly more than once for the same offense, or they would expedite the execution before the quickening of the second fetus. The reasoning was rooted in property law. The state did not want its legal processes endlessly subverted. This shift highlights a change in legal focus, from the theological urgency of saving a single soul to the administrative urgency of executing justice. The possibility of a demonic second conception only amplified the authorities' paranoia. If the first child was presumed to be human, and thus entitled to the reprieve, a second pregnancy while in custody might be taken as undeniable proof that the woman was communicating with and consorting with the devil or one of his incubi in her prison cell. This scenario transformed a clever legal tactic into further proof of ultimate spiritual corruption. Imagine the endless, soul-crushing waiting you endure. Every day is the same: the cold, the meager rations, the fear. You are no longer just a witch. You are a living incubator, a countdown timer to your own death. This waiting game forced many women into desperate psychological states. You might find yourself praying for the slow, quiet dissolution of the community's hysteria. This complicated legal maneuverings where historians still argue whether the practice of pleading the belly ultimately saved more lives than it simply delayed them. It certainly saved women like Abigail Faulkner in Salem, whose execution was delayed long enough for the trials to collapse and a pardon to be issued. But for women like Merga Bien, the delay was merely a few months' grace before a brutal end. It seems the outcome depended less on the law itself and more on the political temperature and theological fervor of the region's judge. Your fate hangs not just on your womb, but on the mood of the magistrate the day you deliver. The waiting game is nearly over. Your time in the prison has been an exercise in psychological torture, and now the delivery is imminent. This is the moment the entire legal apparatus has been dreading and simultaneously anticipating: the postpartum execution dilemma. The instant your child is born, and more critically, the instant that child is baptized, its soul secured against eternal damnation, your temporary shield dissolves entirely. The mainstream historical fact is that in most jurisdictions, the sentence would be carried out swiftly after the birth. The law's obligation to the innocent child had been met, and the law's obligation to purge the sin of witchcraft by executing you now took immediate precedence. Imagine the scene. The joy and relief of a successful, albeit harrowing birth is instantly shadowed by the arrival of the guards, whose purpose has shifted from confinement to escorting you to the scaffold or the stake. You are no longer the pregnant woman under legal reprieve. You are simply the convicted witch. However, the timing itself created immense practical and moral dilemmas for the courts. If they executed you too quickly, what about your physical recovery? This was an era of high maternal mortality. Rushing a woman to execution days after a difficult childbirth could be seen as unnecessarily cruel, even by the standards of the time, and might attract unwanted criticism. Conversely, waiting too long allowed the possibility of escape of appeal or of the local hysteria cooling down, potentially leading to a commutation of the sentence, the very thing the zealous witch hunters wanted to avoid. This tight, terrifying window of time forced courts to make agonizing logistical decisions about the care of the newborn. Who would suckle the infant? Since you, the mother, were about to be executed, a wet nurse had to be found and paid for, or the child had to be handed over to a reluctant relative. This financial and social burden on the community is a quirky or fringe tidbit. Sometimes the sheer inconvenience and expense of caring for the baby after the mother's execution led to arguments for commuting the sentence. The state might decide that a life sentence or banishment was cheaper and easier than maintaining an orphanage for the children of executed witches. The question of the child's future custody created another profound layer of philosophical debate. Historians still argue whether the court's primary concern was the child's welfare or merely ensuring the infant wouldn't grow up to seek vengeance for its mother's death. Could the child of a witch potentially conceived through an infernal conception be allowed to inherit property or even remain in the community? In many cases, the children were socially ostracized, their mother's crimes a permanent, inescapable stain on their lives. Your reprieve has ended. The baby is now a separate entity, legally and spiritually safe. You may have a few days, perhaps a few weeks, depending on the severity of the local court's fervor. You use this final agonizing time to hold your child, knowing that every precious moment is stolen time. The chains that felt lighter during your pregnancy now seem heavier than ever, reminding you that your body's natural process, the very thing that bought you this brief existence, has fulfilled its legal purpose. The next step, the final chapter of your ordeal, is now set in motion by the simplest yet most consequential of human events, a birth. The narrative of the witch trials often paints a picture of helpless victims, and while that is largely true, a pervasive theory emerged in the 20th century that sought to connect the persecution specifically to a certain professional group, midwives and healers. This is a critical point because a pregnant woman on trial often occupied the nexus of female fertility healing and suspicion. The idea that the witch hunts were a systematic, male-driven effort to eradicate female expertise over reproduction is a powerful yet ultimately controversial concept. The theory goes that the independent village midwife possessing traditional knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and sometimes abortion represented a threat to the emerging male-dominated medical profession and the patriarchal authority of the church. By labeling these women as witches, the argument suggests men were seizing control of the birthing process. It is a mainstream historical fact that women accused of witchcraft were sometimes also midwives. We already discussed the Malleus Maleficarum's paranoia about midwives killing unbaptized babies. The records show cases where midwives were indeed accused, but here is the essential caveat. A comprehensive study of the trials across Europe reveals that midwives were rarely the primary target. The vast majority of the accused were simply poor elderly or marginalized women who had often engaged in petty disputes with their neighbors. This is a quintessential, quirky, or fringe tidbit. While some high-profile cases involved midwives, Merga Bien, for example, was an heiress, but others were practitioners. They made up a tiny fraction of the overall accused population, far less than 1%. The historian Christina Larner famously noted that the idea of the witch trials as a war against midwives is a compelling feminist myth, but a historical inaccuracy. The trials were focused on the crime of pact with the devil, not on professional competition. For you, the pregnant accused, the suspicion was less about your skills and more about your fundamental power. Pregnancy and childbirth were viewed with a mixture of reverence and dread. A woman who could bring life forth was also perceived as having the power to withhold life, to cause miscarriage, or to inflict barrenness. If you had any knowledge of herbs or healing, even simple folk remedies, this only served to confirm the charge that you possessed secret, possibly demonic knowledge over the reproductive process. This ongoing debate makes you wonder. Historians still argue whether the trials were an attack on women, as a gender punishing them for being viewed as inherently weaker and more lustful, as the Malleus suggested, or an attack on women as individuals who transgressed social norms through poverty, sharp tongues, or marginal status. Was your pregnant body on trial because of its female nature, or because of its temporary, inconvenient, life-saving status as a host for an innocent soul? In your cell, the distinction is academic, yet terrifying. If you were a midwife, your skills were simply twisted into crimes. If you were a regular pregnant woman, your biological reality was warped into proof of a demonic affair. Either way, the trial system weaponized your fertility, proving that, in the age of the great hunts, a woman's body was never her own. The moment of birth approaches, and with it, the final decision about your fate and the start of your child's life in the shadow of your conviction. As you wait, knowing your time is short, the reality of who was actually vulnerable to these devastating accusations becomes painfully clear. It wasn't just the pregnant belly that condemned you. It was often your social and economic status. Specifically, the vulnerability of single or poor mothers created a clear, tragic line between life and death during the witch trials. It's a mainstream historical fact that the typical accused witch across Europe was a marginalized woman, often elderly, poor, and lacking the social capital, the influential literate family members to defend herself. For pregnant women, being poor or unmarried was an immense multiplier of suspicion. If you were an unmarried woman who became pregnant, your condition was already considered a moral transgression in that highly conservative society. Your pregnancy was a visible, public scandal that made the leap to a demonic pact much easier for the community and the courts to make. Who else but the devil would be the father of an illegitimate child? If you were a poor single mother, the court had an additional reason to be suspicious. Where did you get the money for food? Did you offer your soul for sustenance? More chillingly, if the baby was born, the community faced the burden of raising a child that the mother could not support, and they feared with the paranoia of the time that this child would be tainted by its demonic origins. This meant that the simple act of being destitute turned your plea for a reprieve into a deeper administrative and theological problem for the state. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit. The fear of infanticide among unmarried mothers was a significant concern in the early modern period, separate from the witch hunts. However, the witch trials often merged these anxieties. If an unmarried woman was accused of witchcraft, any unexplained stillbirth, miscarriage, or the death of a child in infancy was instantly blamed on maleficium. The witch delivering the child to Satan or killing it to use its body parts in a terrible ritual. Your reproductive history, even years before your trial, could be dredged up to provide evidence of your wickedness. The wealthy or politically connected pregnant woman, on the other hand, often fared better. We mentioned Abigail Faulkner from Salem. She was part of a prominent, influential family, and her pregnancy allowed the necessary delay for the hysteria to pass. Her family had the means and the connections to petition the governor on her behalf. You, however, may not have that privilege. Your only defense is your body, and your only advocate may be the legal precedent that insists on the baptism of your child. This structural inequality brings us to a crucial historical debate. Historians still argue whether the trials were an attempt to control the poor and maintain the social hierarchy, or if they were a genuine, albeit misguided, reflection of the community's theological terror. In reality, it was a synergy theological panic, provided the justification for a process that disproportionately targeted the economically and socially vulnerable. Your pregnancy, which should be a private blessing, has become a public, terrifying spectacle, amplifying every vulnerability you already possessed. The chains on your wrists represent your alleged pact with the devil, but the chains of poverty and social marginalization are the ones that truly lock the cell door behind you. The sheer weight of the witch trials, spanning centuries and claiming tens of thousands of lives, eventually became too heavy for the legal and intellectual systems of Europe to bear. The high water mark of the panics, roughly the mid-16th to the mid-17th centuries, gave way to a period of growing skepticism and rationalism. For you, the accused pregnant woman, this cultural and legal evolution represents the flickering light of hope at the end of a very dark tunnel. This shift away from supernatural explanations is a mainstream historical fact. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, judges, educated elites, and even many high-ranking clergy were becoming deeply uncomfortable with the sheer lack of verifiable evidence, the reliance on confessions extracted through torture, and the inherent contradictions within the witch trial process, like the one that granted you the reprieve for the belly. The legal community increasingly favored evidence based on observable facts, not spectral evidence or dubious theological theories about incubi. The growing intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment played a crucial role in dismantling the witch hysteria. Thinkers began to scoff at the idea of the devil possessing the power to sexually reproduce with mortals or cause pigs to walk backward. They argued that the great trials were not a defense of God, but a stain on human reason. The legal systems began to tighten up procedures demanding higher standards of proof and critically curtailing the use of torture. Without torture, the flow of terrifying, detailed confessions, the fuel that drove the trials, slowed to a trickle. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit about this shift. One of the key ways the legal system started to undermine the witch trial doctrine was by focusing on the legal status of the fetus in a more pragmatic, less theological way. Instead of debating quickening as the moment the soul entered, jurists started to treat the fetus simply as a valuable human life that was entitled to protection until its natural birth, completely sidestepping the entire demonic conception debate. This move transformed your pregnant belly from a theological battleground into a simple matter of protecting an innocent life from judicial action. For the condemned woman, This changing legal landscape meant that the reprieve for the belly became much more likely to transition into a permanent commutation of sentence. As time passed, judges were less willing to order an execution for a crime they increasingly doubted had even occurred. If you were a witch whose child was born in 1690, your chances of surviving the ordeal were statistically far higher than if your child was born in 1620 simply because the prevailing mood had changed. This leads us to the question that still troubles historians. Historians still argue whether the end of the witch trials was due to a shift in elite opinion, judges and intellectuals stopped believing in witches, or a shift in popular culture. The fear simply burned itself out in the villages. The truth is that the skeptical judges created a legal buffer that protected accused women from the continuing, if diminished, popular fear. By limiting the arrests and refusing to confirm the sentences, the courts effectively ended the panics from the top down. The ultimate legal defeat of your predicament came much later with the abolition of the plea itself. The reprieve for the belly was slowly phased out, not because the state wanted to execute pregnant women, but because the death penalty for crimes like witchcraft and even most common felonies was abolished or severely restricted. The legal fiction that spared your life became obsolete because the underlying capital punishment was removed. In England, the sentence of death, Expectant Mothers Act, wasn't passed until 1931, formally abolishing the belly plea and replacing it with a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment for expectant mothers condemned to death. This final act acknowledges that your temporary reprieve was, for centuries, the only piece of humanity allowed into the savage capital justice system. You have survived the trial, the Jury of Matrons, and the long, terrifying wait. Your child is born baptized, and legally its soul is secured. Your temporary life sentence is now due for its grim conversion into a final permanent one. But the stories of the accused pregnant women don't end with a final quick execution. They leave a long, deep scar on the historical record, often fading into a terrifying obscurity. This silence is the final chapter of their ordeal. A crucial element to recognize is that the sheer focus on the legal exception of the pregnant woman, the reprieve for the belly often overshadowed the individual tragedy. These women were treated as legal problems first and human beings second. Once the legal problem was solved, the child was born and baptized, the record often loses interest. It's a mainstream historical fact that many of the women whose executions were delayed were still ultimately executed after giving birth. However, because of the chaotic nature of the trials, the poor record-keeping, and the administrative indifference to the fate of the mother, once the child's soul was saved, we often lack the specific date, location, or even method of their eventual deaths. You become a footnote in a legal ledger, the one whose sentence was delayed for pregnancy. This historical silence is a profoundly moving, quirky, or fringe tidbit. In the vast records of the witch trials, we have agonizing detail about the supposed pacts, the interrogations, and the theological debates, but a chilling lack of follow-up on the individual women once the child was safely delivered. We know the name Merga Bien and her tragic fate. But for every famous case, there are dozens of nameless women whose fate disappears into the bureaucratic shadows of the postpartum period. Their stories were seen as resolved by the state once the execution was carried out, and thus no further detail was deemed necessary for posterity. Their names vanished from the local parish records, leaving behind only the baptized infant, a child whose entire life began with the trauma of its mother's judicial murder. The very concept of the witch trials, the grand theatrical effort to root out Satan's servants, meant that the system was terrible at accounting for the human collateral damage. The records are filled with grand pronouncements and philosophical theories, but they are cold and silent on the practicalities of child welfare, the psychological toll on the mother, or the final moments of the condemned. This leads us to the ultimate unresolved tension. Historians still argue whether the historical silence surrounding the executed pregnant witch's final moments is merely a result of poor record-keeping, or if it represents a deeper systemic reluctance to document the full brutality of the process. Did the judges and chroniclers intentionally gloss over the immediate postpartum executions because they were morally distasteful even to them? Was it easier to record the theory of the law than the agonizing reality of its application? You are standing at the edge of the fire or beneath the gallows, and you look at your child now held by a stranger. Your last thoughts are not of the devil or the Inquisition, but of that little saved soul who will now carry the weight of your conviction. The story of the pregnant witch is the story of a legal system that was rigid enough to save a soul, yet cruel enough to condemn the mother who housed it, ensuring that even in death her legacy was one of sorrowful obscurity. We've tracked your harrowing journey from the moment of accusation to the shadow of the executioner, noting how your pregnancy became a paradoxical shield, a ticking clock, and finally, an aggravating factor. The story of the pregnant witch during the Inquisition is a deeply uncomfortable and largely forgotten Chapter 1 that focuses not on magic, but on the excruciating legal and theological logistics of dealing with an inconvenient biological fact. Your story and the thousands of stories like yours is a legacy of silence and shadow. We've seen how the legal principle of reprieve for the belly, or Plea Ventrem Inspiciendum, became the single most critical factor in your survival, a testament to the fact that even in an age of mass paranoia, the legal tradition held that the state could not knowingly condemn an innocent, unbaptized soul. This fundamental law, designed to protect the fetus based on the timing of quickening, stands as a mainstream historical fact that dramatically altered the fate of capital crime defendants across Europe for centuries. Yet this legal safety net was constantly frayed by theological paranoia. The belief in infernal conception, the idea that your pregnancy was a result of demonic congress, as seen in the tragic case of Merga Bien, allowed zealous judges in secular courts to try to bypass the legal reprieve. This constant tension between the cold letter of the law and the hot fear of the devil is a defining feature of the witch trials. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the enduring lesson these trials taught about the role of women in the eyes of the law. Your pregnant body was deemed legally significant only insofar as it contained a soul to be saved and was a potential vehicle for demonic proliferation. The woman herself, her autonomy, her plight, her innocence, was constantly secondary to the salvation of the soul she carried, highlighting a profound objectification by the legal and religious authorities. This brings us finally to the broader lingering question that we've touched on. Throughout this deep dive, historians still argue whether the enduring horror of the pregnant witch trials reveals the inherent misogyny and deep fear of female reproductive power embedded in early modern European society, or whether these specific cases were simply an unfortunate clash between existing archaic legal traditions regarding capital punishment and the new zealous intensity of the witch hunts. Was your suffering a feature of the system or a bug? Regardless of the answer, your story reminds us that history is often found in the margins of legal documents and the spaces between the lines of theological tracts. The pregnant witch is a symbol of total vulnerability, a woman caught between the certainty of human law and the terrors of spiritual belief, her body literally a battleground between the state and the soul. The details of your life are lost, but the excruciating mechanics of your delayed death sentence remain a quiet, chilling lesson in judicial cruelty. It's time now to let this centuries-old story fade. The courtroom is quiet. The ink is dry on the court ledger. The flames have long since died down, and the memories of the fear have been swept away by the winds of change and the slow march of rationalism. The heavy, cold stone of the cell is no longer real. You are warm, you are comfortable, and you are entirely safe. Let the tension in your shoulders melt away. The anxiety of the past is just a story, now a piece of dust in the vastness of history. You don't need to hold on to the images of chains or damp dungeons. Focus only on the gentle rise and fall of your own breath. The slow, deep rhythm is all that matters. You are here now in the quiet, and nothing from the distant dark past can touch you. Let the gentle murmur of the words ease you deeper into rest. The night is drawing in, and all the terrible logic of the old world is powerless against the calm of your modern sleep. Just breathe and drift away. Sweet dreams.